Charles, Richard, such a great pleasure to have you here to speak about the art of city making. Two of the world's foremost urban thinkers, and you have been for a while now. And of course, this moment finds us in a very particular state of the world, even though we're starting to speak about the post-pandemic cities and the post-pandemic conversation, we still seem to be very much in the midst of many transformations and figuring out what this new world of ours will entail. So I'd love to start off with you, Richard. I know that even when the world was starting to talk about the death of cities and becoming all tragic and dramatic about what was going to happen with an urbanscape, you were even at that moment in the pandemic, at the very beginning, already starting to say that we should not necessarily jump our guns, that there was a lot to think about in terms of this death of cities. And but it certainly is a reset, and I think you've both written and as well as have spoke quite a lot about these resets of cities, but also about the intentionality that is needed when we are in the midst of these transformations. So if it's starting very broadly, and we will travel the scales of the city together, could you give us a sensation of where you are now? Like where are you? What are you thinking about? What are you perceiving? What are both the perils and the possibilities of the moment that we find ourselves in, very much as they pertain to the urban landscape?
Well, thank you, Gabriella. And of course, I'd rather hear from Charles on this because I hear myself talk far too much, but I'll try to be brief and learn from both of you. Look, I kind of think like the punditry needs to be held to account. I certainly don't mind when people hold me to account. I think, people have criticized my theories and I've responded. It's made my thinking better, but I'm amazed at how many people and media organizations can get away with things like saying in March and April and May of 2020, cities are dead and everyone will leave. Hold these people into account. I mean, it is probably the dumbest, wrong-headed prediction I have ever heard in my life. It's been made before with regard to New York. It was made with regard to New York City in 2001. And again, Charles will know. And again, in 2008, of course, London and New York were both proclaimed dead. My editor at The Atlantic, where I wrote at the time, came to me and said, would you please write a piece on the death of London and New York? And I said, no, you're insane. London and New York will come back. And look, in my own world, I have to be really honest with you. Every time I listen to these people, that's what I do wrong. I dampen down my enthusiasm or my sense of the resiliency of cities. So, one of the things, and I think where I underplayed the role of gentrification, I wrote a whole book about this, The Urban Crisis in 2017, is because everyone else said I was loony to think that cities would come back and cities could be reborn. Now, I think that cities in the United States face greater challenges than cities in Europe. You're in Amsterdam, Charles, you're in the UK, I'm Toronto. I think those cities are going to be pretty much fine. We can talk about like the geography of work and remote work in a second. I think that US cities have different stressors. I think that US cities have locally funded schools, which means their schools have always been troublesome or less good or less advantaged. I think that because of the lack of gun control, US cities suffer from crime and violence. And I think the US has experienced a rise of what I would call urban disorder. There was one mayor I talked to recently called COVID craziness. That is different than certainly what I feel in Toronto. And I think in the US, what you get then is an accelerated demographic divide where young people flock to cities. And I think what we're going to see in the future is young people flock to like and I'm over dramatizing, but New York City is becoming the place for young people in the States. And that's why Google and Facebook and Amazon are opening those installations there. And I think that once people get kids and form families, that's when they spread out. And I think one thing COVID has done is meant that with remote work, you don't have to go to the next door suburb. You could go to a second or third tier city, and the US has lots of them, right? Something Jane Jacobs said to me a long time ago. Richard, what's interesting about the US has just lots of cities. Or you can go to a rural area. And I think one of the things we've seen, I'd love to hear Charles's thoughts on this, is a lot of the so-called creative class, artistic, culturally creative people, designers, musicians, in the United States particularly, have always had a kind of a strong urban vibe, but a strong rural vibe. So you see the rise of these places like Woodstock or the Hudson Valley outside of New York. Look, I think what's going to change is the geography of work. I think remote work is the big shift. And I think, it's going to challenge those central business districts of major cities. But I think they could be better. I wrote a piece called The Death and Life of the Central Business District, playing off Jane Jacobs' great book, The Death and Life of Great Cities. And I think that, this whole idea that you would pack and stack knowledge workers in office towers and put them there 9 to 5 and they would commute an hour and a half or 2 hours each way. I think that's giving way to what you called, what I wrote a book on, the Great Reset, a great reset and a great thinking of how we live and work. And just one last comment. I think much of this resetting and rethinking goes to the advantaged third of us who happen to be the knowledge and professional and highly educated, knowledge-based or creative workforce. I think the rest of society falls further and further behind. No choice but to live close to work, no choice but to commute to a job, have to work in a service industry, a manufacturing industry, in a warehouse. They have to be near other people, be near customers. So I think it also creates an even wider divide, if you will, between socioeconomic groups and racial groups, a widening divide. And that I think is one of the features of the post-pandemic world.
I completely agree with that. And in many ways, as you well pointed out, perhaps you were even what the creative class and the transformations through the creative class that could happen to cities, perhaps you underplayed, and that was actually the dangerous bit. If you've been speaking about the intensifying and extensifying cities in a very provocative fashion, but perhaps also right now we have to think about that diversification and the perils of both gentrification as well as segregation in a much more interesting fashion. And I think that goes back to the intentionality that you were speaking of. Right now, if you were in charge of urban policy in some of these major star cities, if you will, like what would you be thinking about so that this moment where so many states of exception are coming in for better and for worse, where the rules no longer apply as we used to know them, what would you be thinking about so that this reset can really be used to travel in a direction that we think will be sustainable in the most nuanced of ways?
Well, I think what you said, and one of the things that's really frustrated me is the lack of intentionality. We've had this ongoing conversation about public health and restrictions and masking, and very important, critical, right? Literally no conversation about how do we rebuild our communities post-pandemic, as if they'll either rebound to what they were or morph into something completely different without any intentionality. When there's a natural disaster like a hurricane or a great flood, or a great fire, like there's a lot of thought given to recovery. There are long-range recovery plans. We've had very little of that in the States, for sure. Very little of that in Canada. Interesting to know if you've seen more of it in Europe. I mean, we have these vague things like, Joe Biden, who I think is terrific, build back better, but there's not a specificity to that. And who knows if the stuff will even get through the Congress. So it leaves the kind of mixture of civic organizations, public-private organizations, foundations on their own, and they kind of wing it. I just wish there was more intentionality and more thinking and more engagement of local experts and people who study cities. What worries me, what keeps me up at night is, I became a student of pandemics because of this pandemic. Didn't know anything about them beforehand. And I've studied the Great Flu a lot, the Spanish flu. And what was the Spanish flu followed by? The Roaring 2020s. What does it look like this will be followed by? The Roaring 2020s. A big boom in the stock market, a big economic boom, but one that furthers inequality. If I was the head of a superstar city, I'd have a different take in the US versus Europe. If I was the head of a superstar city in the United States, I'd be really worried about the quality of my schools. Look, people are not leaving cities because of the pandemic in the United States. They're leaving the cities because of schools. They want their kids to go to school. They don't want the schools to be shut down. They want their kids to have open space to play in. And the other thing I'd be really worried about is escalating crime and violence and what I called urban disorder. Then I would start to worry about affordable housing and the use of transit. But look, I think US cities face, I wrote an opinion editorial in the New York Times in 2017, which I titled The Urban Revival in America Was Fragile. They retitled The Urban Revival Is Over. And I said, look, what's going to challenge big cities in the United States are escalating housing prices, gaping inequality, the politics of NIMBYism, not in my backyard syndrome, no growth, and rising crime and violence. And the pandemic made those problems more. I would also encourage mayors to work together. I think in the absence of real federal urban policy in the United States, I think it's up to mayors and city leaders and foundations to do it. In Europe or Canada, I think cities have a much finer future because they're far more family friendly, schools are better, you have a much more long history of less dependence on the car, you have much better gun control. So, I think the US cities face a kind of, I hate to say it for folks, I think they face a unique set of challenges, but challenges that have long been there. been there for the past 50 years. COVID has just accelerated them.
Charles, I think that that is a great segue to one of the subjects that is incredibly close to your heart nowadays, which is creative bureaucracy. So in many ways, you've been speaking about the need for governments to become flexible and supple and agile and transdisciplinary, breaking through silos. And I think what many of the things that Richard is mentioning right now point to the need for both having very deep political imagination of the type of cities and societies we want to become, but also knowing what it means to have, as you have mentioned in some of your talks, feet on the ground. Like, what does it actually take to make these urban visions and social visions come to life? Because obviously political imagination without the feet on the ground is just like this big utopia that will take us nowhere. But at the same time, we've also seen, I think, with the technocratic turn of cities in the last decades, that just like trying to solve challenges one after the other makes us get caught into a crisis without really diving deep into this other political question that cities also have to be asking themselves again, like, who do we want to be? How do we want to live together and move together and be healthy together? So I would love, as a follow-up to Richard's comments, where are your thoughts on this? Like, what are the responses to this times at hand, and what is this art of city making nowadays?
Well, can I pick up Richard's last word, which was accelerate? I think the pandemic was incredibly useful from the point of view of what the creative bureaucracy is about. I mean, obviously the phrase is a provocation. Not every bureaucrat is creative, but it's sending a message out that, you know, the millions and millions of public servants are not all stupid, and many of them have imagination. They're obviously often stuck in systems that doesn't allow them to give of their best. And we've done various studies on this. And in general, people's discretionary effort, i.e. the effort they don't give but could give if the situation was better, is minus 35%. So there's this massive resource. And so the pandemic, which obviously the 2020 was a year of radical reckoning, you know, people had to think and reflect and so on. And in that, there was a mixture, I think, of clarity and confusion, and not always the knowledge of where to go next. But what it did do in many cases made the impossible possible. And obviously the digital turn made, for example, public servants realize that you can do things in different ways. Now, whereas before this whole idea, this movement was very much driven from, let's say, business, civic worlds and so on, and saying, look, you've got to change. If you want to keep interesting people in your public administrations, you've got to give them a work life that actually makes sense to them when in their private life, they're operating in a completely different way. So that shook up, into some extent, the bureaucracy. And now my conclusion from our last festival was really that the top and the bottom are really beginning to approach each other. Now, the interesting thing, and I'd like to pick up Richard's point about cities dying or not dying, I certainly think it's sort of flattened geography to some extent, that if you, and of course not all people can work from home, there are all these millions of workers who are working every day, they obviously have opportunities, and then can, if you're working at home 2 days a week, you can live, I don't know, 100K away, and that's okay. And that creates an interesting balance between the overall ecosystems of regions that some places, just looking at Britain as an example, are becoming slightly more vibrant because these people think, well, Christ, I also want to have a more, let's say, interesting life where I'm living. So those trends are happening. And I think, as Richard points out, it's never really an either or situation. Cities are alive? No, they're dead. In fact, two things can happen simultaneously. They can become more vibrant or economically prosperous, but also other places can benefit as well. And I think the bankruptcies that you talked about, or the near bankruptcies, New York and others 30 years ago, showed that the massive resources that a core city has, even if it isn't in New York, but it could be a small city, so powerful. That's quite difficult to replicate, and they all represent needs. Clearly, I think it also depends on personality. And I'm forgetting for a moment the millions of shop workers and all of those people, the garbage people, just for a second. They perhaps have more choices than before. But I think that if you look then again, and Richard mentioned Hudson Valley, you can see that movement of, let's say, quotes, creative, because as you know, I believe many people can be creative beyond those defined as creative. They're spreading out in Berlin to the Uckermark, which is just one of these areas, in Britain into a variety of cities and so on. So I think there's a series of centripetal movements and centrifugal movements happening simultaneously. Finally, just on the creative bureaucracy, the reason I got into that is we talked about, you know, interesting businesses, interesting social innovation, interesting creatives and all of that. But we all know that the city is a sort of complex organism. And if one part of it is a bit too rigid, the whole system can't really work. But I mean, I'll just leave one final thought, perhaps might lead into your next questions. You know, there's COP26 happening just now, this moment, you know, the climate collapse or climate crisis, whatever you want to call it, is really sharpening people. And when you talk about the art of city making, the forms of creativity that are coming up, I mean, I just had a session 3 hours ago with someone who's doing amazing things with blockchain to monitor exactly in time, seamlessly, how people are using energy and so on. So there's all this stuff going on that will happen even further.
Those are great points. And as a follow-up question, Charles, so you've talked about what I basically say is a suspension of disbelief, if you will. Like government itself learned during the pandemic that it could work in ways that it had no idea it could. But the state of exception, I think, in politics and in government is both a silver lining because we can act more agilely, we can learn how to be government in a different ways, but also it can entail as well the suspension of everything from civil rights to whatnot. So I'd wonder, like, what are your thoughts on this need for experimentation and agility? Like, and what is the best of both worlds in that sense, taking into consideration this space that we're in right now?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, many of the people who are protesting about things are basically talking about the Great Reset in another way and saying that it is about suspension of civil rights. But I mean, there are so many movements happening simultaneously. And again, it's difficult to see things from a helicopter point of view. One, of course, is the whole data privacy movements and all of that. And the question there is there a third way? There's a Chinese way, which is authoritarian. There's a US way that may be more sort of business driven. And in Europe, at least, there's an attempt to try to work out how can you make the best of these digital possibilities and at the same time have some sort of public interest protection. So I think the jury's out whether the sort of clamping down that has been happening will open out again. And this is where I think people like in Taiwan, I mean, you all know Audrey Tang, the amazing digital minister who's found ways of both working with and against all of these social media groupings in a way that creates sort of, I suppose I'm using the typical words, empowering, inclusive ways of operating through civic tech and so on. So I think the models are out there. I mean, what I always find, if you take this helicopter view, many of the answers are already there. It's just that we're not putting them together. And in a sense, the groupings, the governments and the other parties, certainly looking at it from a European perspective, aren't talking to each other on equal terms. It's a bit too much, I'm this, you're that. And there's not a common language and a common, I don't like using the word vision, but let's say a common ambition to actually let each party do the best at what they are good at.
Absolutely. So it seems that both of you for a while now have intersected in several subjects such as creative cities and public policy, urban development. At the same time, that there's a lot of intersections, I think that perhaps you both embody different sides of the spectrum sometimes, perhaps Richard, labor and land, Charles, culture and civics, and this creative bureaucracy that we've been speaking about. So under those lenses, I ask, right now, what has the pandemic changed for the creative class? Because besides, both of your names are very much associated with creative cities. And what is calling them to cities now? Like, are you seeing any interesting shifts in a theme that both of you have worked on for several decades now, if in different ways and with changing notions?
Sure. And I like Charles's concept of creative cities and creative industries better than my own. I got to learn so much from Charles after I wrote, I wrote that book in 2002, and I think Charles and I met in 2003 or 4, and I've just learned a ton from him ever since. Look, when we talk about the creative class, I think it's a very advantaged group of people who work in science and technology and the arts and business and management. They've gotten some degrees of freedom from this crisis. If you ask me who's gotten the greatest degrees of freedom from the crisis, it's the 0.0001%. And if you ask me who's really leading the urban exodus out of cities like New York, it's super rich people who are doing a tax arbitrage. It's real simple. Like, you move to Austin or Miami, you save a bundle of money. You keep your high-tech company in San Francisco, or your real estate firm in New York, or your banking firm up in the city. And you just save a whole bunch of money by saying you've relocated to Florida or Texas. But for the creative class, that advantage third or 40% of Americans, maybe a little higher in the Scandinavian, the people who work in these industries, I think it enables them to have more flexibility because of remote work. I mean, these are the kinds of people like myself who always gravitated towards remote work, who always enjoyed remote work, who don't like being told what to do. So yeah, I think it's enabled them to choose locations with a bit more freedom. I think the big change in the US, and again, I'm speaking of the US here in particular, because this change does not exist in other cities to quite a degree. It's what Charles called centripetal and centrifugal. It's what I call the push and pull forces. The people being pulled out of cities, the creative class people being pulled out of cities, are people with families. People who have kids, 2 kids, 3 kids, want more space, want flexibility, are 40 or 45 years old, roughly, late 30s to early 40s, early 50s, who have an established personal network, who can live where they want. When I visited Peter Jackson many, many years ago in Wellington, New Zealand, he said to me, look, when I was a young director, I had to live in Hollywood because nobody knew who I was, and I had to get a job, and I had to prove myself. Now I'm Peter Jackson. I made the Lord of the Rings. I can live in Wellington, New Zealand, and people will come to me, and jobs will come to me. I think for young people, look, I've read all the history of pandemics. If folks are up for it, Ed Glazer's new book on the survival of the city. The best part of that book is the stuff on the history of pandemics. Ed's done a wonderful job with that. Look, you look back at the history of pandemics, young people have always moved to cities. Think about the labor shortages we have today. Companies competing for talent. Young people, that's always happened in the wake of pandemics because they were far more deadly and they killed more of the labor force. So young people have always gone back to cities for the economic opportunities they offer, but also in today because of the social, dating, mating markets they offer. So look, I think we're seeing this big demographic divide, and they also need to establish their careers. They need to build their networks. They need to, find their way. And big cities offer a social environment, a job environment, a professional environment. So you're going to see the split city. And in the US, just, if you look at it, half the gain of so-called urban revitalization in the 2010s came from young college-educated people, 25 to 34. So yeah, I think in Europe, in Canada, and Asia, cities still become more family-friendly. There's still less of that demographic divide, but I think the big thing, and the other thing, and just to pick up on what Charles said, I wanted to write this for a long time, and I've dribbled and drabbled about it, but if you look at the cultural history of Europe and the United States in particular, and you look at artistic and musical creatives, a lot of them have been drawn to big cities. Don't get me wrong, Greenwich Village and Left Bank and all of this mythology, Bohemian London. But a lot of them have also been drawn to rural areas. And, when I was writing Rise of the Creative Class in 2000, it looked like a big urban surge. Cities were coming back. People were getting interested in cities. They counted out for dead. I think that there's always been this kind of rural creative class, the people, the painters who went up to the Hudson Valley, Bob Dylan and the band going up to Woodstock, New York, the hippie communes outside of LA and San Francisco. So I think what remote work does is allow people to avoid kind of the generic suburbs and actually to leapfrog to these very interesting rural places that are now far more affordable and look to me like they're really becoming creative hubs. So I think there's a lot that's changing. It's not a wholesale change. It's more subtle and nuanced, but I think there's a lot of changes going on.
And I guess it could be argued that then in any case, because serendipity seems to be such an important thing in this conversation of this ideas jumping back and forth from one body to another, from one discipline to another, from across borders, et cetera, that perhaps.
One other thing I'll say, because I just saw you and I thought about you living in Amsterdam. When we looked at venture capital startups, this is interesting, and it's not quite the creative class, but it's a good leading indicator. When we looked at venture capital startups on a world scale in a report I did with Ian Hathaway, we found something quite interesting. The US and the Silicon Valley used to account for the preponderance of them, right? 20, 30 years ago. Now the US has half of them, not 99%. Its share has declined by half. Where have they gone? Now, obviously, big cities like New York and London, but Berlin, Amsterdam, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Shanghai, Bangalore, Mumbai, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Bogota, Mexico City. It's really interesting to see that in terms of this indicator of where the people who are going to fund and create startups have gone. That has become very global. And there's been the rise of these creative or innovative hubs all over the globe that weren't, I mean, they were there, but they weren't attracting venture capital 23 years ago. So I think the globalization, if you will, is another phenomenon that's super interesting.
And cities as conveners, as you've mentioned. Charles, what are your thoughts on this? On what is calling creative talent to cities nowadays? How do you envision?
Well, I mean, I agree with Richard, because I'm just doing an overview for UN Habitat about the type of thing that Richard's talking about. And obviously we're in this nomadic world where lots of the startups are, of course, tech driven, and so therefore don't physically need to be, let's say, in San Francisco and so on. So I completely agree with him. The other thing I agree with him about is what I call the testosterone imperative. And the testosterone imperative is one that will draw people of different ages, I would say, obviously the young in particular, back to cities. I think that what's quite interesting for me, and I'm just looking at it because what I love about Richard's work is the nitty-gritty detail about who's going where, how, and so on, which I can never get my head around. But just looking at it from a more planning perspective is really that shift in the way we talk about things. We used to talk about urban development, then we talked about urban design. Now we talk about placemaking, and placemaking obviously blends in, you know, the people and the physical and all of this together. And I think what has happened is accelerated, back to that point about acceleration Richard mentioned, you know, it accelerated the digital turn, it accelerated various things. It's also accelerated that idea of proximity. I mean, effectively, the 15-minute city is really places of proximity. And I think that's where we're getting that that overlaps with this whole issue of quality of life and livability, and can you just wander around and meet friends and community. And it sets more of a precondition for that than to have to say, oh, I want to do something, I have to get in my car and drive here. So I think that thing about proximity will be a thing that will stay as a very important thing and will shift the way cities look and feel. So that's one thing, I think. The other thing, I think, and this is still a problem that Richard talked about a long time ago, and by the way, I used to get very irritated when people complained about you in the creative class, because they said, look, nobody's bloody perfect. That's what he saw, and that was good enough. Did you know something better, you idiot? Anyway, forget that for a moment. But it is this question of affordability. And what's interesting there, I mean, the Amsterdams, the Berlins, and all of that, they're really rethinking that. And one of the pressures, and we'll see if it comes back, is obviously the tourism pressure and over-tourism. Yes. And the major organizations we're working with, Visit Berlin again, is to redefine obviously what the tourist is. Are they the temporary resident? Which gets you back into this point of this spectrum between the person who actually lives somewhere full time, going back across the spectrum, and the person who's partly there, sometimes there, very rarely there. And so what is the resident, what is the citizen, is also to some extent being challenged. So I think these are quite interesting topics, for me at least.
Can I jump in on that? Do you mind? I agree with I think Charles has raised some very, very important points. One, I think with regard to city building and placemaking, in a way, they have been increasingly blamed for gentrification. And I think there is a point to be made there. that when you make a place nice, and look, it's not just big cities figured this out first. The New Yorks and Londons of the world and Chicago's of the world figured this out first. But it didn't take long for the Pittsburghs, you know what I'm saying, and the industrial towns in England and north of England and their equivalents in Europe and in places in Asia to figure out that if you made a place more attractive and you invested in so-called amenities, arts and culture, you attracted really interesting chefs. You know, there's whole shows about this, like Chef's Table. Anthony Bourdain made a whole, if you attracted and built a food culture, if you created and emphasized your music culture, you build an interesting place and people would like it. Well, what happens when that happens? People start to move and prices go up. And I think now with the COVID crisis, what I wrote about in 2017 and I called the new urban crisis, I said it was the fundamental crisis of capitalism. Too many people trying to jam themselves into too little space, driving up prices. And what's happening, you know, it's the revenge of Henry George. Henry George and the American Marx. Marx said the world was divided into labor and capital. Henry George said, no, Marx, you have that wrong. The world's divided into labor, capital, and landlords, and the people who take the surplus are the landlords. That's exactly like the COVID crisis and the knowledge economy are Henry George. It's like we have this boom in productivity, this boom in innovativeness, the boom in the stock market, and all the money goes into dirt. All that money that's been spread around the world has just gone into escalating housing prices. So now when you look at small, and not just Amsterdam and Copenhagen and Berlin, you know, these spectacular, the high amenity, beautiful cities of Italy and France, you know, look at Bozeman, Montana, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Salt Lake City. You could go down a list, Traverse City, Michigan. Housing prices, Austin, Texas, up 33% in a year. So the new urban crisis of housing unaffordability has become an everywhere crisis. And Charles said something else, which I just find really fascinating, over tourism. If you ask me one of the biggest problems, in addition to increasing crime and urban disorder in US cities, facing great cities, it's over tourism. And I came up with a new name. I winter in Miami Beach, where we see our entertainment district turned into, I don't know, a giant area of disorder. I was just in Nashville, a city I love, and I'm going back. In downtown Nashville, my friend counted, Charles, 57 party buses, he counted, on one evening. At Las Vegas, and you see this in the UK with kids traveling to parts of Spain, Portugal. I call it blotto tourism. I don't know where it came from. This idea that you go to a place and get blotto drunk, and people from all over your country go and get blotto drunk with you. Look, a city has to be for its residents. You said this so well. And if a city becomes overrun with disorder of any kind because of criminal activity or tourist activity, and therefore, I think all of these ideas that seem like good idea, like apartment sharing, this stuff has to really be regulated. And traditional tools, like we're talking about city making, zoning, land use regulation, regulating where clubs are and hotels are, and not letting them bleed over into great neighborhoods. This is something we've really got to think about long and hard, because the combination of rising disorder and over tourism or blotto tourism is really eating at the fabric of some great cities.
Can I just add to that for a second, Gabrielle, if that's okay? Because I think there's a reaction going on precisely because of these sort of issues Richard is talking about. So, for example, Berlin had a referendum 3 weeks ago, which agreed, and it's a, whatever you call it, a suggestive referendum, to take back in compulsory purchase 200,000 apartments from private ownership and put them into public ownership. That's just one reaction. The other thing is in terms of what we need to be thinking about, is innovative, I don't know, regulations as well in relation to greening. So there's a hell of a lot of innovation to be happening, which is why I'm so obsessed with the creative bureaucracy, that has to be in part led by public administrations, either suggesting it or something like that. Because as you say, there's a new world emerging to which we have to respond.
And I would say, as housing and real estate have become an investment commodity, we need to think carefully about that. You know, one of the most attractive commodities on the market is affordable housing. I think Blackstone bought $9 billion of affordable housing from AIG. So thinking about how to align private investment in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is a big emerging theme, certainly in Europe. The idea that private capital can be deployed at the margin to achieve better resiliency, better sustainability, more inclusivity, better affordability. It's not going to do it on its own, but aligned with public. It's not like the government has to do everything. The government can regulate and add subsidy or add incentive on top of private spending, and I think do a lot of good. And I think that's what we've got to think about. We've got to think about how to align private, public, bureaucratic, administrative, and steer that in ways that creates more affordable cities and cities that work for more people. I think right now we have great cities that work for an advantaged few, and that group is getting smaller, not larger. You know, if cities like San Francisco and New York and London used to work for the creative class, they now increasingly work just for the global oligarchy. So thinking about how to make cities work for everyone is important, and how to do city building or placemaking in line with that is critical.
Absolutely, which would point, I think, that this intentionality that we were speaking of needs to go down deeper into another layer, which is very much about public purpose, if you will, and who a city is for. That I think is one of the bigger conversations. And following on that, I'd ask my last question. So we've spoken quite a bit about many potentials that this moment has. And at the same time, perhaps one of the other things that we need to address in these times at hand is this other crisis that has nothing to do with economics, but perhaps with civics, no? Which is, as they'd say, like the undoing of the demos, like the democratic crises, which would seem to lead to a different set of questions of what to do nowadays. And I think the conversation that we just had more or less leads into that direction of saying everything from surplus capture for public purpose instead of economical gain. So I'd be curious to know, like, how, if we don't take for granted that economic opportunities of the pandemic and of these times at hand are identical to the civic opportunities of the times at hand, what should we be thinking about going forward at that deeper layer of the conversation of the type of cities and societies that we want to be?
That's an interesting one. And being in Europe, I mean, you in the States have got your own problems as well, but we've got variations of it. But I'm just thinking about various groupings. I mean, Fridays for Future, all of these types of organizations which are pushing, in a sense, another agenda. I think we are in a democratic crisis. People say democracy is exhausted. I think the values of the Enlightenment, although, you know, it led to imperialism for some, have got some wonderful values. And I think we've got to project ourselves with far more confidence. I mean, you know, the dictators around the world are saying we're all weak, those who think of liberal democracies. I think we've got to speak with more strength. Now, that is just a generalized statement that doesn't help you do something tomorrow, but it actually means that we've all got to be much more active. You know, because some of these things are very subtle. You know, in the UK, there are negative things happening with our governments, and because people are charming, you can't sort of feel it. But I haven't got the silver bullet for that one, I'm sorry to say. But what I do know at a general level, one of the things we can do, and this is where the private sector might really help as well, is you've got to bend the market and all these forces to bigger public purposes. And in a sense, it reminds me really of storytelling. Somehow to tell the story of this world we're trying to create, this planet B that's more green and all of this sort of thing, that feels compelling to the individual that hears it. I know storytelling doesn't seem like the actual, you know, the silver bullet, but I think it's part of it. And that's where imagination comes in as well.
So I think Charles is absolutely right. I think that we are going through something that looks like a democratic crisis, but it's interesting. You know, I think the rise of the populist right and Donald Trump in many ways forced this conversation, because this was a group of issues that were off the table. And working people, you know, this shift began a long time ago. It began in the United States with Richard Nixon, when working class Democrats began to vote Republican. It certainly was accelerated by Ronald Reagan. I grew up working class, so I grew up with this in Newark, New Jersey, Italian American. I saw it all. And I think Donald Trump is in many ways an heir to this. I don't want to say completely an heir to it, but he mobilized this kind of blue collar working class sense of being left behind. You saw it with Brexit in the UK. Your country is being taken away. And he mobilized that. And I think in the United States, it's opened a very interesting conversation. Look, Trump was an abomination, but it's opened a very interesting conversation about the future. And I think we'll survive. I mean, I don't think we're going to go the way of the 1920s and 30s with the rise of fascism and communism. I think we will survive this. I hope we will. But I think there's a couple things we have to do to survive it that are just now being talked about. The first one's being talked about, the second one less. First, I think the oligarchical class has just gotten extremely wealthy. This happens during economic transformations. It happened in the 1890s. And there are mechanisms you can use to distribute that money. One is called taxation. So I think we need to use taxation more strategically to reduce the gaps or to share some of that surplus. And also the estate tax. I mean, if you ask me, one of the few things the US has done right, the estate tax forces people to set up philanthropic foundations and not hoard the money the way it's done in other societies. So at some point, Henry Ford had to turn the money over to the Ford Foundation. At some point, Bill Gates had to turn some of the money over to the Gates Foundation. Same thing's going to happen to Bezos and Zuckerberg. So I think a stringent estate tax and higher rates of taxation on wealth and somehow managing these state differentials that allow people to move around. The other one that I think is the bigger agenda, and I want to throw this on the table, love to hear what you say and Charles said. If you ask me, next to oligarchical wealth, the second biggest problem and what's behind the democratic crisis is what I would call the imperial presidency and these national governments that have just collected way too much power. And I think what we in urbanism, people like James Jacobs called subsidiarity, the late Ben Barber called devolution, power to the cities, power to the metros. Look, I'll just give you the US data. In the United States, roughly 75 to 85% of people are strongly dissatisfied with the federal government. Look at Joe Biden, high approval, plummeting. About half and half on their state level. 85% of people have a strong level of confidence and trust in their local government. And I talk to mayors. I have a podcast called The Mayors. I talk to mayors all over this country and Canada. Mayors, Republican and Democrat, are the same, roughly the same agendas. And even when you do surveys of ultra liberal people and ultra conservative people who are just worlds apart on national issues, they're pretty much unified on local issues. So I think the biggest thing is that we have to deconstruct these overly powerful national governments, push power down to the local level, and then let, to use Charles's phrase, creative bureaucracy and creative public-private partnership thrive at the local level. But we're not talking about that. We just accept the fact that we need these overly powerful imperial national governments, which I think are a big part of the problem, both from public policy and a big part of the problem in our democratic deficit.
I think he's right. I mean, the whole global parliament of mayors is just one little fragment of trying to address that rebalancing and that new contract between state and city, which obviously requires the resources which the national government keeps. But over to you, Gabriella.
No, I was actually just going to ask for your parting words, Charles, as well as Richard, if you have anything else to share with our public before we sign off. But it was such a pleasure to have you both and your experience leading this discussion.
I'm going to just repeat partly what Richard said. I think to some extent power to the cities, and that's my parting word for today.
Look, I think, Gabriella, first of all, thank you. I think my parting words are, we live in interesting times. And just, 20, 30 years ago, Frank Fukuyama, a brilliant guy, was talking about the end of history. Well, he was right on a lot of his things he said, but, history has come roaring back with a vengeance. We are in the middle of probably one of the greatest economic transformations in human history, the shift from physical labor power and natural resources to the human mind as a means of production. We have great divides, we have great traumas, we have democratic deficits, but through this, we are persevering and cities are leading the way, to go back to Charles. So, I could get all pessimistic and go, it's all going to hell in a handbasket, but I don't think so. I think human beings are resilient. And we're going to figure out a way out of this. There's plenty of daunting problems we have confronted before. And I think the most important thing we could all do, folks in this conference, is really embolden this shift. Charles called it power to the cities. I think this idea that cities and metro areas have to have greater levels of self-determination and keep many of the resources they hand over to the national government is a big, important shift. And that maybe that's the key to city building and placemaking in the future. That cities and metro areas, these constellations of city, suburbs, and rural areas, just need more of their own resources, and they should chart their own way. They shouldn't be under the heavy hand of federal governments or national governments, or in the US retrograde state governments that are preempting them. I think if we can do that, we'll end up in a pretty good, look, life's not perfect. It's full of warts and, hurdles, but I think we'll end up okay.
I couldn't agree more. I'm biased, but when we work on the Mexico City Constitution, that was one of my biggest joys in terms of upgrading the autonomy of Mexico City vis-a-vis the federal government. So what a huge pleasure. Thank you, both of you, as well as thank you to our audience for joining this conversation. I'm sure you leave us all with a lot of things to think about. And hopefully we will continue this conversation in other ways and in other places.
Thank you, Gabriella. Thank you, Richard.